Thank you everyone for joining us today for our educational discussion on the Philippine elections called Philippine Elections 101, What is at Stake? So this educational discussion was put together by the Malaya Movement USA's National Education Committee, in the hopes that we get to be made aware of what is this thing that is coming up, right? The Philippine elections. Next slide. By the way, my name is Yves. I'm the current national chairperson of the Malaya Movement USA. And we're a movement of individuals and organizations across the United States, Canada, and in Australia that came together really under the banner of human rights, democracy, and sovereignty. Right. Just to remind folks for our discussion tonight, it's just some house rules. This educational discussion is being recorded. Folks will be muted. Feel free to engage in the chat. If you have questions or comments, there is a person there named Questions where you can send your questions. But feel free to drop your comments in the chat box. All right, next slide. Yeah, so as mentioned earlier, we are a broad movement of individuals, organizations, and various formations united under the common objectives of defending, upholding, and asserting human rights, democracy, and sovereignty in the Philippines. Next slide. And just to give a context, why are we having this discussion today, right? We in the Malaya movement, we were formed back in 2018, really in response to what we believe is a human rights crisis unfolding in the Philippines, with the war on drugs and attacks on human rights defenders, and what we also see, as a looming dictatorship, with the constant attacks against democracy by the current Duterte regime. Back in 2019, we held a national summit for human rights and democracy, wherein it was participated by more than 300 individuals across the country. And in that summit, we have discussed the current state of the Philippines and various issues, right? And in that summit also, we have resolved that we must end the Duterte regime if we are to defend human rights, democracy, and sovereignty, right? And this year, we are now on the 6th year of the Duterte regime, right? And supposedly, we are expecting the natural ending of the Duterte regime as his term ends, in June 2022. But we have reasons to believe, right, that the Duterte regime is hell-bent on holding on to power, if not at the very least influencing the results of the Philippine elections to favor him. All the motives for the Duterte regime to cling on to power is there. Many lawsuits are waiting to be filed against Duterte and his collaborators in the government. The International Criminal Court is investigating his crimes against humanity. So we believe that the upcoming Philippine elections is a key arena of struggle, in our continuing fight for human rights, democracy, and sovereignty. Next slide. So yeah, our objective is, many of the folks here tonight are probably, hearing about the Philippine elections for the first time. Many of our members are US-born Filipinos who are trying to grapple with the what is going on in the Philippines, and what is really what to expect, right, with the Philippine elections in 2022. In this discussion, we also hope to provide a critical analysis of the Philippine elections, not so that we will have a better understanding why is it important, but at the same time, what are the limitations of the Philippine elections? Next slide. So our discussion tonight is broken down into 3 sections, right? The basics, what do we need to know about the Philippine elections in general? And then it will be followed by what is up with the 2022 Philippine elections, and what is at stake. And then lastly, what are the issues surrounding the elections and what are the limitations? And then we will give some recommendations as well. So with that, I'll turn it over to Andrew to lead us into the first part of our discussion.
Thank you, Yves, and welcome everybody. My name is Andrew. I'm from Malaya Movement, Baltimore. It is excellent to see so many people joining this call. Next slide, please. So I developed this section. I'm one of the many Malaya members from who were born in the U.S. and know very little about the electoral system in the Philippines. So when the opportunity presented itself to learn more about it, that's why I sort of took on this section. I'm hoping everybody through different contributions, comments, however you want to contribute, hoping people can enrich it, take what I'm using as sort of a foundation and enrich it. So, we're tackling it, one, to just give us a very foundational knowledge of how the electoral system works and just a little bit of historical context, and sort of, answer the question, like, how do we end up with this electoral system wherein these Philippine presidents that you see on the slide, that have such huge impact on the country's policies and on the people. Next slide, please. So to briefly cover some of the historical context, a lot of historical accounts would tell you that the 1907 elections were the first elections in the Philippines, at least for president and vice president. But the real first presidential and vice presidential elections took place at the Tejeros Convention in 1897. This was, so the convention was actually supposed to be talking about the defense of Cavite during the Philippine Revolution against this Spanish colonial system. But this convention turned quickly into a debate between different forces within the Katipunan. And the convention ultimately established the revolutionary government against the Spanish crown. After Spain was ousted and the Philippines was swept under the umbrella of American colonialism, the Filipino people still fought for democracy in the whole archipelago. Because the first Philippine Republic was not in full control of the archipelago, the 1907 election was the first national election of the whole country. Even so, it was held under American colonial rule, and only those with land and wealth were able to run and vote, which sort of began the system of, only, the wealthy and landed elite being able to run the government, and these elite would sort of pass down their political power through their families, essentially creating the system of political dynasties. And then later, the Tydings-McDuffie Act in 1936, a lot of people may know the Tydings-McDuffie Act as what granted nominal independence to the Philippines, but really it allowed the United States to write the Constitution and establish their own republic, and established the Commonwealth of the Philippines, and a unicameral national assembly. So that means one house of the National Assembly, whereas previously there were two houses. And the graphic here is from the Malolos Congress of 1899, which was part of the struggle to establish elections and different democratic machinery. Next slide, please. So then the Japanese occupation disrupted the development of the Commonwealth and established a second Philippine Republic. But as soon as the war was over, which was World War II, the Commonwealth was reestablished, and things sort of continued this way until the Marcos Dictatorship. The Marcos Dictatorship used martial law, a bunch of different political mechanisms to effectively do away with term limits. And it's sort of not exactly the way to put it, because he did sort of manipulate the system to have terms, but continue to ensure his victory in the elections. But the People Power Revolution ousted him in 1986, and that graphic there is a picture from the streets during that revolution. And so term limits, as we know them now, were reestablished in the period following and officially instituted in 1992. I think it goes to something we'll talk about a little bit more. The People Power Revolution and the ensuing reforms, it's a case study in how crucial the mass movement is, and how parliamentary systems, parliamentary politics, they're a barometer of the strength of the mass movement. We wouldn't want to speculate on what the political system might be if the mass movement hadn't overthrown Marcos, but it's entirely possible his dictatorship would have continued, and then again passed down undemocratically without elections. Next slide, please. So now we're getting to some of the very logistical stuff. Congressional and local elections, except for regional and barangay, they've been synchronized to be held on the second Monday of May every 3 years, starting in 1992. Presidents and vice presidents have 6-year terms, so these are only elected on even number years. And then there's the midterms, where they're on odd number years, and the president and vice presidency is not on the ballot. Next slide, please. And then who can vote? Again, some more logistical nitty-gritty. All citizens of the Philippines not otherwise disqualified by law, who are at least 18, shall have resided in the Philippines for at least 1 year, and in the place wherein they propose to vote for at least 6 months immediately preceding the election. But of course, there have to be pretty significant provisions allowed for absentee and overseas voting, given the decades-old history of the labor export policy. Any person who temporarily resides in another city, municipality, country, et cetera, because of occupation, profession, et cetera, shall not be deemed to have lost original residence. And if they register as a qualified voter, they'll be able to vote either from overseas or through absentee ballot. Next slide, please. A little bit more on who can vote. All citizens of the Philippines or dual citizens who are not disqualified by law, at least 18 years of age, by the 9th of May, 2022, so that's election day in 2022, are voting for president, vice president, senators, and party-list representatives. Next slide, please. And this is something I think was particularly helpful for me, who has grown up under the United States electoral system. This is not aimed at saying one of these systems is better, one is worse. It's really just to draw out some of the key differences. And I've separated by political party, term length, and the electoral college. In the Philippines, all the positions are voted for separately, versus, our last election, it was either Biden-Harris or Trump, was it Pence? Was it Pence again? I don't even remember anymore. Who cares? So, in the US, we're used to seeing, one of two of the major political parties being elected altogether, whereas every position in an election in the Philippines is voted for separately. They can be in completely different parties. And then there's the party list system in the Philippines. I will not feign to pretend that I understand this completely. But the basic part of it that I found, it was a big takeaway for me. The party list system was established in the 1987 Constitution after Marcos was ousted. The idea was, there are underrepresented sectors like peasantry, urban poor, the indigenous communities, women, labor, youth, for example. This is a carving out of some democratic space for these sectors. It accounts for 20% of the House of Representatives. There's some very complicated calculus to establish how many seats the party lists win. But basically, this was, another result of the mass movement that recognized, even through all the turbulence and different reforms, the Philippine system of governance, the whole time was still principally run by a wealthy and landed elite, and under political dynasties, which of course we'll talk about a little later in the presentation. But even this fight to carve out democratic space was challenged in the Supreme Court, and a party list no longer has to just represent an underrepresented or marginalized sector. And there's continued struggles against the party list system. Next slide, please. There's a couple key dates to keep in mind. Voter registration closed already, sorry. January 7th and January 15th. So January 7th, they released the final list of presidential candidates. So the list that we have, that's it. And on the 15th, in 5 days, they're going to start printing the final ballots for preparation and distribution. April 10th through May 9th is going to be the period of voting for overseas voters. And then May 9th is election day. 30 days after the election, the Congress convenes to canvass the results and then proclaim the president and vice president. Next slide, please. Some interesting statistics that we pulled from an op-ed. Some of it's up for debate. I mean, the point of the op-ed that we'll be posting in the chat was to challenge some of the estimates given by the Comelec. But to the best of our knowledge, as of September 2021, there's more than 63 million registered voters. The gender gap is between 3 and 6% in favor of women. 35% of registered voters are between 18 and 29. 54 are between the age 30 to 59, and 12% are seniors 60 and above. There's an op-ed linked inside this op-ed that we're drawing from that says, okay, yeah, the age 30 to 59 do have the largest percentage, but the youth vote might be the most decisive. in this upcoming election. So I think that would be interesting to look into. The last count of overseas voters in 2016 revealed 1.37 million, which is about 2% of registered voters. Something the article said was voter turnout amongst overseas voters was as low as 10%, which is, something we should look at. It makes candidates seem to sort of disregard overseas voters as part of their campaigning. But I think this election could turn out different, and I think it's something that would be interesting to see. That's the end of my presentation, and it was a whole bunch, but thank you for your time. I'll pass it off.
Yeah, thank you, Andrew. And just to add on to the the numbers that out of 1.3 million overseas Filipino voters, right? Only 10% are usually actually cast their votes, and but something to note as well is that they said that even though overseas Filipino voters represent 2% of the total registered voters, they have a multiplying effect because of their influence in their families back home, right? So you can count, not to count that like one overseas Filipino vote is equal to 5, but their voice in convincing their family members is important. No, so many politicians or candidates do not disregard the overseas Filipino vote. No, and just in particular to the U.S., I believe the recent numbers are around 150,000 registered voters in the U.S. No, and I think this will be a point of something to pay attention to. No, for all of us who are in here and for those who want to ensure their participation, in the upcoming elections. All right, thank you, Andrew. So with that, we will go to the next section, which is what is up. So Andrew has given the general overview of a brief history of the Philippine elections, and then just some general details. So now, what are we expecting, right? This coming May. So next slide. So what we know is that this is one of the general elections wherein Filipinos get to choose, a president, a vice president, 12 senators, and a party list of choice, right? That represents their interests or appeals to their interests, right? Noting also that there will be local and provincial elections where people will be electing, mayors, vice mayors, representatives to the Congress. And stuff. Yeah. Next slide. It's noting here that overseas voters can only cast their votes for the national level. Hence it's part of our focus. In the elections, overseas Filipinos will receive their mail-in ballot or their ballots in the mail. If they're registered, and they will be able to choose, right, who president, vice president, senators, and the party list. Next slide. Yeah. So who is running, right? So let's start off. We're gonna try. This is not an exhaustive information as to who are the ones running, right? We in the Malaya movement hope to develop later on some materials, educational materials that folks can use, right? But let's go first with those, with this tandem, the Ferdinand Marcos Jr. And Sara Duterte. So Ferdinand Marcos Jr. or Bongbong Marcos, as is more popularly known. If his name sounds familiar, it is because he is the son of the ousted dictator in 1986, No, he has their family, despite being ousted, was able to regain, um, has come back into the political life, right? By running into local positions and eventually climbing back up, even becoming a senator. And in the 2016 elections, he ran for vice president and lost to the current vice president, Leni Robredo. Um, and he is running for president. No, his tandem, or his partner, not partner, his vice president of choice is Sara Duterte. If the last name sounds similar, that is because she is the daughter of the current president, Rodrigo Duterte. No, uh, she was a former vice mayor and then mayor of Davao City. Um, there were discussions back then whether who between the two will run for president. And I think from what we know, um, uh, some brokers eventually decide that Bongbong Marcos should be the president and Sara Duterte be his vice president, right? And this is to give the Marcoses the chance to be able to have a shot at the presidency. And yeah, some of the discussions as well is that the Marcoses, as they were courting the support of the Dutertes, right, promised them that if he is elected into power, right, that he will protect the Dutertes from any prosecution later on for the crimes that they committed against the Filipino people. They have a platform of unifying the country. Bongbong Marcos is running under a sort of "Make the Philippines Great Again" slogan. Again, that sounds familiar for those who are here in the U.S. And have experienced the past 4 years of the Trump administration. He claims that the Ferdinand Marcos dictatorship was the golden era, of the Philippines. When data and history is saying the opposite, right? It plunged the Philippines in poverty and buried the Philippines under millions of dollars of debt as they plunder the wealth of the country. So this too represents not only a continuation of the current regime, not only the continuation of the current regime's policies, right, but they also represent the return of the Marcoses in the highest position of the country, right? It completes, if elected into power, right, it will complete their decades-long effort of climbing back up after they were ousted by the historic people power uprising. Next slide. So yeah, just noting here that Bongbong Marcos has been in some of his interviews said that he will shield Duterte from prosecution, and that he will not cooperate with the International Criminal Court, and he has also denied the having any knowledge of the crimes of his father's reign. It's as if someone is denying the Holocaust. That's pretty much the effect that they're going for, despite the history saying otherwise. Next slide. So the next tandem that we're gonna look at is Isko Moreno and Dr. Willie Ong. They're running under the Acción Democrático. Isko Moreno is the current mayor of Metro Manila, one of the more populous or one of the larger cities in the Philippines. he is running under the banner of a unifying president. Something to note is that he does not want to play into the pro-Duterte, anti-Duterte sort of discussion. He would like to distance himself from that, but in a way has been sort of seen as courting the endorsement of Rodrigo Duterte. He said he will not prosecute, or he will not hold Duterte accountable. He for his crimes against the Filipino people. His other notes on him in terms of economic policy, he said that he does not support ending labor contractualization, which is an issue that many Filipino workers have been, that have impoverished many Filipino workers. He is also open to working with China, despite the struggle in asserting the Philippine sovereignty over the West Philippine Sea, and then of course his vice presidential candidate is really not a known politician. He's not even a politician. He's been known to post on Facebook Live on medical advice and stuff like that. So there is that. Next slide. The next person or the next candidate that we're going to look at is the current Vice President, Leni Robredo, formerly or is part of the Liberal Party, but is currently running as independent. And then her vice presidential candidate, Senator Kiko Pangilinan. So something to note, right? Leni Robredo does not necessarily belong to a particular political dynasty. Was a human rights lawyer at some point, and her candidacy, she was chosen by a coalition of democratic forces under Isang Bayan. They saw her as the best fit to represent the opposition against the Duterte regime. She has released, some of her plans if elected into power, right? She has promised to ensure that those who have committed human rights violations under the Duterte regime will be held accountable. She has stated publicly that she will end or abolish the National Task Force to End Local Communist Armed Conflict, though there were controversies when she took it back and later re-clarified that she supports the abolition of that National Task Force. She has said that she will not enter into agreements on the West Philippine Sea and with China until such time that China recognizes the Philippine sovereign rights over the West Philippine Sea. She has also promised to support the resumption of peace talks, with the National Democratic Front of the Philippines. Though I think in some discussions, her economic policy and her more so platform in the economy is something that is still being developed. She has released, some videos out there with regards to how to respond to the COVID pandemic, as well as providing employment for many Filipinos. Right. So something to note is that many of the opposition does see Leni Robredo as the main opposition candidate to challenge, the current regime, and to challenge the Bongbong Marcos and Sara Duterte. Next slide. Noting too that they're not the only ones running for president and vice president. Manny Pacquiao is also running for president with his vice presidential candidate Lito Atienza, former mayor of Metro Manila. There's Senator Ping Lacson and Senator Tito Soto, who were former allies of the current Duterte regime, are also running. And then there is Leo de Guzman, who is a labor leader running under Partido Lakas ng Masa together with his vice presidential candidate Walden Bello, and then many more, right? Next slide. Yeah, and there's more, right? So just noting that there are a lot of candidates running for Philippine elections, and we do and the challenge in providing an educational material is that many of these candidates have not really published their positions, their platforms. And then despite even with publicly available platforms, right? I think from our point of view, it is really important to look at their track record. What have they done in the past? And on top of what they are planning to do, what they say they're planning to do, right? Because as folks have those who are familiar with politicians, it's easy for people to promise one thing and then do, and then once they're in power, they do the opposite. Next slide. In the upcoming elections, right? Just noting the polls and surveys of the popularity of some of these candidates. Again, we advise folks to take this with a grain of salt. Some people say that these surveys are paid for or commissioned by some candidates, right? But as it stands, there are this survey notes that for president, Bongbong Marcos is up there with 50%, followed by Leni Robredo and then Isko Moreno. For the vice presidential candidate, there's Sara Duterte with 40+%, followed by Tito Vicente Soto and then Kiko Pangilinan. We're showing this not to sort of contribute in that conditioning of the mind of the public, but more so for us to understand, right, what is the current political climate and what is the information out there, right? Yeah, next slide. Because there's really a lot of things at stake, in the upcoming elections. These upcoming elections will either, be a vote of confidence and re-legitimization of the Duterte-style government, right? And then this election also means, many people are frustrated with the current pandemic response, right? And then the fate of the West Philippine Sea, right, is another major issue that folks are looking at. So let's just go down the list, right? So the pandemic response, many people have noted that the current pandemic response of the Duterte regime has been very disorganized and incompetent. It has been filled with militaristic lockdowns without mass testing and the slow provision of vaccines. So we need to look at who among the candidates has really a comprehensive and clear plan on how to end the pandemic in the Philippines. Next slide. And then on human rights, who among the candidates have had a track record of upholding human rights, and who are those that are sort of justifying and serving as an apologist for the crimes against humanity of the current regime. No, a vote for the administration is a vote in support of the continuation of the war on drugs and the war against human rights defenders. Next slide. Democracy is also on the table, right? A vote for the administration candidate is a vote that will further drift the Philippines towards authoritarian rule. The anti-terror law is there. The National Task Force to End Local Communist Armed Conflict, and a vote for the administration will mean a deepening hold of political dynasties in the Philippine government. Next slide. And on Philippine sovereignty, right? A vote for the administration will mean continuation of the sellout of Philippine sovereignty. Particularly on the West Philippine Sea. As we all know, the Philippines is getting caught in the middle of a new Cold War between the US and China, right? So we need to look for a candidate who will, not put us in this situation and will not sell out Philippine sovereignty and not take in lopsided economic agreements that puts the Philippines at a disadvantage. Next slide. And lastly, with peace and justice, right? A vote for the administration candidate means a continuation of the counterinsurgency program that thinks that the armed conflict in the Philippines is just a matter of killing every activist and every a vote for the administration is a vote for a view of the armed conflict wherein it's just a matter of killing all of government's enemies, right? And not addressing the roots of the armed conflict, which is really injustice, right? The problem of landlessness, joblessness, etc. Next slide. Now that is why we are also noting that this elections is really energizing and drawing many of our compatriots, many Filipinos to jump into to get involved in political activity, as we have noted already in the US. Many people are organizing these caravans or gatherings that show support for one candidate over the other, right? Just noting that many people have been organizing pink caravans in support of the candidacy of Vice President Leni Robredo and Senator Kiko Pangilinan. And from the point of view of the Malaya movement, right, this represents a desire of the Filipino people to end the current regime in the Philippines and to reject his style of government. Next slide. Just trying to look at before I move forward, just looking at the questions. Yeah. Do the presidential and vice presidential candidates no, they get elected by simple plurality, so they don't need to get the majority of the population. They just need to get the biggest share of the votes cast in the upcoming elections. So some analysts are saying that historically Philippine presidents only need up to I think 30 to 40% of the votes cast. Noting that Duterte won on 16 million votes, um, uh, and not necessarily the majority of the votes cast. So that is why I think it connects to the statistics earlier that if the youth votes as a bloc and they represent already 30% of the registered voters, that they can really shift. They can make or break someone's candidacy. All right. So with that, um, again, that's not the exhaustive list of the candidates and their platforms. We hope to produce more information later on their actual platforms and issues that really matter to the Filipino people. So with that, I'll turn it over to Jo May to discuss, a critical view of the Philippine elections issues and limitations.
Thank you, Ves. Again, thank you to Andrew as well for really laying down the foundation to help us understand the Philippine elections and in particular the elections of this year. As mentioned, this portion will dive deep into the issues and limitations that come with the elections. And to start, we will define the historical essence of elections in the Philippines. Next slide, please. All right. In 1969, Ferdinand Marcos resorted to strategies such as vote buying, ballot snatching, and straight up violence to secure his position as president. It was through these tactics that the phrase guns, goons, and gold was popularized by journalists and media, used to describe the culture of Philippine elections. And as a reminder, I know it's already a little bit alluded to, mentioned earlier, Ferdinand Marcos was a dictator who declared martial law in the Philippines, just a short 3 years after media identified the 3Gs of Philippine politics. And so though the phrase was coined decades ago, we will see how this still rings true today. Next slide. Yeah, thank you. Okay, so focusing on the goons and gold, vote buying and selling have unfortunately become an expected aspect of election season. Now, what exactly is vote buying and selling? It is when a person who gives, offers, or promises money or anything of value directly or indirectly in order to vote for or against a candidate, as well as withhold their votes. The anything of value also includes any promises of employment or material goods. This is particularly important to note as many people who are preyed upon come from poor backgrounds. Aspiring politicians see their vulnerable socioeconomic position and use it to their advantage. Oftentimes, the candidate themselves tend to shield themselves from liability as they convince barangay leaders, also known as neighborhood leaders, or use other individuals to commit the transaction. In 2019, during the last election, over 400 people were arrested for vote buying and selling. And in one case, 2 bills of 500 pesos were placed inside sample ballots. And the dollar equivalent of that is roughly just $20. And so this speaks to what I mentioned about the poor being preyed upon. However, bribery does not always secure a candidate's seal. Thus, cases of election-based violence also do occur. And then before we move on to the next slide, I do want to offer a quick trigger warning, as the next couple slides do talk about violence and violent descriptions. So please take care of yourself however you need. But next slide, please. And then to talk about election-based violence, we are going to talk about the world's deadliest single attack on journalists and the worst case of election-based violence, which occurred in 2009 in the Philippines, in the town of, you'll have to forgive my pronunciation, in the town of Ampatuan, in the southern island of Mindanao, often referred to as the Maguindanao Massacre. Ishmael Mangudatu was filing for governor candidacy in Maguindanao, but the convoy was stopped on the way in the town of Ampatuan. Two things to note here. Mangudatu was not even on the convoy because he received a number of different threats and intimidation. So he stayed home while 8 of his relatives, including his pregnant wife and dozens of media personnel and journalists, traveled to file his candidacy and to document it. The town they were stopped in was ruled by the powerful Ampatuan clan, who at the time held multiple political seats, including governor, whose family's political power can be traced to the support of then President Gloria Macapagal Arroyo. Next slide. So the case, though again occurred in 2009, would go on for roughly 10 years, with over 197 suspects, and 28 of those suspects with the surname Ampatuan. When the case first broke, witnesses claimed that it was Andal Ampatuan Jr. who carried out the vicious attack, who at the time was mayor of a neighboring city and was planning to run for governor to succeed his father. Throughout the case, there were several instances of bribery and intimidation of witnesses. Even Nina Santos, who is the lawyer of Mangudatu, was offered 300 million pesos. On December 19th, 2019, a guilty verdict was finally delivered for brothers Datu Andal Jr. and Zaldi Ampatuan. Despite the verdict, though, 78 of the accused remain at large, and many of the surviving families continue to face harassment, threats, and intimidation. Next slide. Okay. So how else do we see the Philippine elections tampered with? Through fraud and manipulation. Throughout Philippine history, there is a historical trend that confirms this phenomenon. In the 1949 elections, votes were fabricated so much so that journalists described the votes coming from the birds, the bees, and the flowers, saying ballots were padded to comical proportions. During the election between Marcos and Cory Aquino, pro-government, or actually pro-Marcos, newspaper and media would report on a false lead that Marcos supposedly had on his opponent. The lies resulted in many employee walkouts whose job was to observe and count the votes. There was even an international group of observers who identified numerous cases of fraud done by Marcos supporters and noted none done by his opponent. Now, this election occurred in early February of 1986, and if that sounds like a familiar year, it should, because it was also the end of martial law in the Philippines. So it's no wonder why Marcos would scramble for power and try to consolidate his power and solidify himself as president. Next slide, please. Okay. Following up more on election fraud and manipulation was the Hello Garci scandal of the Arroyo presidency, which made headlines when a leaked recording of a conversation between President Gloria Macapagal Arroyo and then election commissioner Virgilio Garciano exposed Arroyo asking for confirmation regarding a 1 million vote lead against her political opponent for the presidential election of 2004. Though she confirmed that it was her voice on the recording, she denied that any cheating took place. And following the scandal, there were 3 impeachment trials, which all ultimately failed. And so Arroyo was not only able to complete her presidency, she actually continued her political career by going into Congress. And then she was in hospital detention from 2012 to 2016 on corruption charges, but she was later acquitted, namely by the influence of President Duterte a month into his presidency in 2016. And Duterte actually later appointed her as Speaker for the House of Representatives. And so this is a perfect example of how a high-seated politician who was never punished or even held remotely accountable for her crimes was instead allowed to flourish, especially with political alliances in her favor. Next slide. Okay. And so another way election fraud and manipulation has been documented in the Philippines is through the issues associated with automated voting machines. They were introduced more recently in 2010 as a means to counter election fraud, as the transmissions were also much faster. However, new problems ended up coming up. There were a number of machine malfunctions, such as paper jamming or rejection of ballots. And even in 2018, when a cumulative 82 enhancements were made in preparation for the following year's election, there were still irregularities. People's votes were not counted. Ballot receipts reflected what people didn't cast. And what was most suspicious, at least to me, was that the server stopped sending real-time results for hours to the media when it is supposed to be sent every 15 minutes. And more recently, the Comelec has finalized a contract with F2 Logistics, who will be responsible for the transportation of election-related supplies, so ballots, voting machines, whatever have you. But this company has direct ties to Duterte, as the chairperson of the company is one of Duterte's highest donors of his 2016 campaign, Dennis Uy. The Comelec asserts, however, that there is no conflict of interest, but in a high-stakes election where alliances seem to be key, the people can't help but disagree. Another thing to note here is, just like going down the list, SCL Group, which is the partner company of Cambridge Analytica, are both in the industry of behavioral research and strategic communications. What this means is that Cambridge can, and ultimately did, influence public perception of candidates by utilizing the data access primarily from Facebook to target individuals for political campaigns. In 2016, Cambridge had a hand in developing and encouraging Duterte's strongman image. A now suspended CEO, Alexander Nix, even claimed that the company has a 100% success rate in countries, including the Philippines, where they could take an otherwise fundamentally flawed candidate and elect them easily by highlighting their positive traits. So really skewing with public perception and trying to market candidates as a means of like their own, as whatever they want themselves to be perceived as. Next slide. I know this is like a lot of information. If folks have like any questions, please put them in the chat. Take note of anything. It's a lot of information for me too. I know there's like the last bit of the presentation too, but stick with me. We still have a couple more to go through. But now I'll be moving into these two aspects, which are dynasty and substitution. Maybe you've heard of the term political dynasty, especially in Malaya spaces, and especially with this current election year. But what exactly is political dynasty? It is the succession of rulers from the same family line. This prevalence, the prevalence of this in Philippine society, however, is so extreme that 70 to 80% of elected offices come from political dynasties. This then breeds a culture of personalities, not of policy, which is highly dangerous if people are not leading their vote by who is alignment with the people's needs, but instead with whose names are most familiar to them. Politics in the Philippines have even overlapped with celebrities. Probably most famous, and probably most familiar to you, is Manny Pacquiao, who is a famous boxer, becoming a senator, and even also throwing in his hand to also run this year. And so the political dynasties also do not just aim for the national stage. They often run from local seats all the way up. With Sara Duterte running for VP after her father's presidency, guess who's running for Davao Mayor? It's her brother. So again, perfect example of seeing how political dynasties are highly entrenched in Philippine society on all levels. Next slide, please. And in regard to substitution, where a political party has a substitute for their original candidate, it is actually completely legal to do so under 3 circumstances. The aspiring candidate dies, is disqualified by the COMELEC, or withdraws. However, the substitution clause, the substitutionability has been widely scrutinized for 2 things. The theatrics of substitution, some argue, are a strategy for public demand to increase. This was actually the criticism for Duterte's back and forth in 2016, him saying he's going to run for mayor, he's going to run for president, actually mayor again, maybe president, and keep going back and forth, flip-flopping. The term is like drumming up public demand. And then some even argue that was a strategy done for his daughter, for Sara Duterte, who also claimed she originally was going to run for mayor. And then it also actually buys time for candidates to unite with their political parties or even secure alliances ahead of time and see the deadline for presidential and vice presidential candidacy is before the substitution deadline. Okay. And so the following slides will explore disinformation and its role in the elections. Okay. So think about yourself, your family, your friends. Think about how many times you scroll the internet. Maybe you're scrolling on it right now because it's a lot of information, which is okay. But think about what social media apps you use and what you use them for. How much time do you spend on the internet? Is it 30 minutes? The American average is just over 2 hours. Well, in the Philippines, Filipinos spend an average of 4 hours and 5 minutes a day. And nearly half of Filipinos get their news from the internet. I don't blame them, especially because many news websites and academic journals have paywalls or subscriptions, making them highly inaccessible. I'll be detailing 2 social media platforms in particular, YouTube and Facebook. YouTube is quite interesting, mainly for the reason that they have a very loose policy on disinformation, and they don't actually provide a fact-checked label on any fact-checked material. So this allows disinformation to stream very freely. And that celebrity culture I mentioned earlier, of course, overlaps with social media, where influencers use flashy headlines and their familiar face for thumbnails, making people more inclined to click on their videos. Not to mention, a lot of these videos are purposely edited to look legitimate, looking like an actual news source, maybe like a desk, like very formal clothing. So it further blurs the line between disinformation and credible sources. Next slide, please. Okay. And speaking of social media apps, I know you or someone you know has Facebook. And that is no mistake. In 2013, Facebook launched a free internet initiative in the Philippines, which allowed access to the internet to Filipinos of all socioeconomic backgrounds. And of course, access and ability to create a Facebook and utilize Facebook Messenger. A whopping 88 million users, or 78% of the population, is on Facebook. The platform has also become a breeding ground for ample disinformation. The Facebook algorithm skewing what people see on their feeds, sometimes making false information, sometimes catapulting false information into the hands of millions. Though there exists third-party fact checkers, there is a loophole on Facebook Messenger, where Facebook Messenger is actually allowed to run a lot more freely when it comes to the spread of disinformation. So sometimes, to bypass fact checkers, influencers, or disseminators of disinformation will instead create group chats for massive amounts of people and spread information that way. Next slide, please. Okay. So how exactly has the power of Facebook been seized by political figures? In 2016, Duterte's team saw the platform for what it could do for the president. His social media knew they did not have the funds for TV, radio, print, billboards, which are all traditional forms of communication, especially when it comes to election season. They instead turned their eye to Facebook, where they reached out to high-profile influencers, celebrities again, some of which millions of followers, to help their campaign. Duterte's literal engagement on Facebook was actually relatively low compared to his opponents, meaning he actually wasn't posting or creating any status update. However, it was with the use and the power of his troll army that they just did all the work. And so they even hired people solely for the utility to create fake sites, accounts, and materials, often smearing the legitimacy of political rivals via memes or posts. And again, engagement is a big strategy here. By sharing, reacting, commenting, the Facebook algorithm worked incredibly in favor of Duterte and the image his social media team aimed to accomplish, which was at the time a strongman. Duterte's online fan base, who stands by the stream of misinformation, has actually shaped and even altered the state of Philippine politics and elections now. The rise of fake news and distrust of media only affirms the legitimacy of social media news. We can see how this will be used in the 2022 elections, especially in consideration of the pandemic, where many people's internet use has gone up, people are staying home, and the influencer/celebrity culture continues to expand globally. So this is something that we have to stay vigilant against this upcoming elections. And so who does this actually impact? It of course impacts people who are new to social media. And that can mean anyone who's young and even old, especially old. I know for me, my parents who feel like they have the world at their fingertips through Facebook, utilize Facebook as a means of news. But they are susceptible to the disinformation on here. Anyone who's newly interested in politics or their country can be swayed by the hundreds, maybe even thousands of posts that they see, often with conflicting information. And of course, marginalized groups can also be impacted by the power of disinformation. Next slide, please. Stick with me. I need to take a breath too. Okay, now we're going to be moving into voter disenfranchisement. How do politicians, whether knowingly or not, divorce the people from what they see as their vote or as their power being their votes? This is very particular to the pandemic, but what we've seen especially for the OFWs, which is an acronym for Overseas Filipino Workers, is there was only a 2-week extension from September 30th to the middle of October for OFWs to register to vote. This is wildly difficult, especially considering, again, the global pandemic. So many people either still had to work, were unable to get paid time off, and the distance to registration centers were really insane. I mean, one example that I saw actually is, say, for example, OFWs in the Midwest, the consulate that's tasked to that area covers 12 states. And so we're talking about people needing to cross state lines just to register to vote. Of course, making it highly inaccessible, and especially if they don't have time, given that they're here working. And then, of course, back home, the COVID impact on registration was immense. There was about 5.5 months of voter registration suspended due to the militarized lockdown. And then a really scary report that I came across was about 46% of Filipinos said that they would actually skip elections if the cases are high. Which, if folks have been keeping up with cases in the Philippines, they actually have been increasing, especially this past week, being upwards of 12,000 a day. And then vaccination rates still only remained I believe at like 52, 53%. Okay. Whew. Next slide, please. Okay, this is it, everybody. All right, with all this information, I'm gonna take a breath after this too, and ample examples. What then can we gather from all this information? What are the limitations of elections, which are meant to be a pillar of democracy in society? We can turn to history to show us that elections have been mainly the playground of those already with power and wealth. We can look to the political dynasties. 70 to 80% of seats are political dynasties, making it very difficult for new people in politics trying to make a break, vulnerable to manipulation, despite efforts to make automated machines. That contract between the Comelec and F2 Logistics is very suspicious. And then I think what's important to note here is that the material conditions feed into this breadth of manipulation, creating almost an ecosystem of manipulation, if you will. What I mean by that is that there is a culture of impunity, especially heightened and popularized under the Duterte regime, where even critics and dissenters and journalists have been targeted and even harassed and even slain. So then we see the rise of fake news, making people more confused about who to trust. And then again, political dynasties. Political dynasties, as Andrew mentioned, is a historical thing. We see it dating back decades in Philippine culture. But what else has history also shown us? It shows us that elections is a time where many people are engaged in social issues. Upwards of millions of Filipinos get engaged when it comes to the elections. On this webinar alone, there's almost 200 people, which is incredible considering how this flyer was put out only a few days ago. So it shows us that people want to be engaged and people want to advocate for their needs and their rights. People who are organized and conscious are the main agents of change. One example that I want to bring up is there was that election between Ferdinand Marcos and Cory Aquino, where he did try to tamper with the elections in early February of 1986. However, what happened later that month was people power won. It was the people who came together in the millions to oust Marcos and essentially run him out of the country. That energy, however, I will argue, needed to continue because the power of the people needed to not die down. If anything, it needed to strengthen. And if anything, it needs to strengthen right now, where it is through the active participation of people that the cause of human rights, democracy, and sovereignty will be advanced, meaning to say that it is our right and our duty to organize. So we must engage in these elections. However, it is still up to us to build a mass movement reflective of the people. Thank you.
Thank you, Jamie. So we have heard from the historical overview or a brief historical overview of the Philippine elections. Really, the key takeaway there is that the Philippine elections bear the mark of the Philippine colonial and feudal history, right? Colonial, where the Philippine elections was patterned and deeply influenced by the United States, and its feudal history of really political power revolving around 250 families since time immemorial until now. And as folks have shared that political dynasties are the same families who control the land and who has a lot of wealth already and are dominating Philippine politics. And we have also seen the limitations or we have seen what is at stake at this upcoming elections, wherein many people actually see the upcoming elections as an existential issue to the Philippines, right? And to many people, it is a life and death issue, right? Depends on who gets elected in 2022. right? Will the carnage of the war on drugs continue or not? And the attacks on human rights defenders continue or not? And, Jome took us to, the various issues and limitations surrounding the Philippine elections, not to poke the credibility of it, but really for us to understand as a mass movement, right? That it is not enough to pin our hopes on the Philippine elections, as a medium of change, right? Next slide. So yeah, some recommendations, right, from our point of view in the Malaya movement. Next slide, right? Seeing that we need to end the Duterte regime by any means necessary, right? Knowing all of this information, right? The Philippine elections, as I mentioned earlier, is now a key arena of struggle where all Filipinos and allies alike who stand for human rights, democracy, and sovereignty need to really pay attention to and organize around. So from us, right? We encourage everyone to demand for clean and honest elections. We know that some organizations or we must ask for the international community to pay attention and ensure the credibility of the Philippine elections, and we must demand. Next slide. We must demand for a clean and honest elections, right? All of those controversy around a Duterte crony handling the logistics of the elections must be criticized, be exposed and opposed, right? We must also encourage and the organizing of international observer missions, right? We need people to actually directly monitor the credibility and the conduct of a fair elections. Number two, as mentioned by Jome earlier, right? Social media will play a huge role in the upcoming Philippine elections, especially in a time of pandemic, an unrelenting pandemic in the Philippines due to the lack of a comprehensive response from the Duterte government. We need to fight against disinformation. The Malaya movement has a campaign to engage social media here in the US, to let them know about the negative impacts of their policies in the Philippines, right? Number three is to uphold the people's right to vote. We believe that we should organize to ensure that as many people get to cast their votes, that as many people get to cast their votes against the current regime and the administration candidate. And we know many of our compatriots here in the US and around the world are really gearing up for elections, and we must lend our support in ensuring that the people are able to vote for the opposition. As number four, right? If you are registered to vote, definitely exercise that right. We must get other people who have registered to ensure that they vote against the regime. And lastly, to get organized. As mentioned already, we need to get organized, not just to be able to ensure that we get to vote against the regime. We need to get organized to defend our votes, with signs of potential manipulation of the elections in favor of the administration candidate. We need to be organized to respond immediately at the slightest signs of manipulation of or tampering of the results of the elections this coming May. And we need to organize beyond the elections, to ensure that the current regime is held accountable regardless of who gets into power, right? We need to ensure, we need to get organized to ensure that the necessary fundamental reforms in Philippine society are implemented, regardless of which government, which administration are put in place. Next slide, and we just want to end this presentation with this short video, which we think summarizes some of the points that we made. Yeah.
Kini usa ka bantugan nga revolusyonaryo walay lain kundi si Bernabe Dante Boscaino. Mababato. Ayun po, ngayon ay ang masasabi ko po, kayo hindi ko na kailangan ipaliwanag pang mabuti. Talagang nandiyan pa yung kahirapan natin. Kahit na umabot tayo ng 200 milyon sa yaman ng Pilipinas, napakayaman ng magbuntok natin, may mga minerals yan, may mga mina, napakalawak ng gubatan natin, lalo na sa Sierra Madre na pinagtaguan ko, ang lalaki ng mga punong kahoy, ang daming nyog, ang daming tubuhan, ang daming ilog at dagat na maraming isda. Saan ka nakakakita? Kapag gustong magkape mga Pilipino, no, wala silang asukal. Gustong magprito ng tuyo, wala silang mantika. Gustong gumawa ng bahay, wala silang tabla. Gustong mag-ulam ng isda, wala silang ulam. Oh, paano po yung maling patakaran ng ating bansa? Pinakukutkot natin sa mga dayuhan, yung ating dagat, inuuwi nila yung mga nauhuli nila. Pinahahakot natin yung ating troso, pinahahakot yung ating mina. Yun namang kopra, dapat dito na gawin kung anong nagagawa dyan na napakaraming bagay upang magkaroon ng trabaho, ay dinadala pa kung saan, sa labas. At kung meron mang ginagawa sa Maynila, ay hindi na po ari. Huwag na tayong palinlang dyan sa komunismo na yan. Walang komunismo. Ang problema natin, kung matapat mong pag-aralan, ano ba talaga yung problema? No? Yan, kawalan ng lupang masasaka, kamahalan ng bilihin, kawalan ng trabaho, pero masusolusyonan natin yan kung matapat ka. Kailangan magkaroon ng tunay na reforma sa lupa, ng tunay na pambansang industrialisasyon, ng isang gobyerno na ang mamamayan ang nakapangyayari, isang bansa na hindi pinakikialaman. Yun ang solusyon. Kahit na sinong Pilipino, yan ang magiging solusyon niya kung matapat yung pag-aralan ng ating problema at kung maayusin ng ano yung solusyon. Kaya kung bumapayag kayo mga kababayan, narito si Dante, hindi upang magpaboto. Kung hindi, ang gusto ko lang sabihin sa inyo, kung gusto ninyo talagang magpagbabago, kung gusto ninyong makaalis tayo sa kahirapan na yan, ano nga ba yung pangarap ng tao? Napakasimple ng pangarap ng tao. Kung sana gusto mong kumain, meron kang kakainin. Kung gusto mong magbihis, meron kang damit. Kung gusto mong manahanan, meron kang bahay. Kung gusto mong paaral ang mga anak, mapapaaral mo. Kung may sakit, mapapagamot mo sana. Meron kang kinabukasan, meron kang kapayapaan, meron kang dignidad, meron kang pagsasarili. Yan ang pangarap natin. Pero hindi manggagaling po yan kung kanino. Manggagaling lamang po yan sa atin lamang. Tayo mismong gagawa. Ang tagal na nating naghintay sa mga palit-palit na gobyerno. Ang tagal na nating umasa na sana manalo ng ganitong kandidato ay magkakaroon tayo ng pagbabago. Ang tunay na pagbabago mula sa kahirapan tungo sa pagkakaroon natin ng tamang buhay ay manggagaling lamang sa mamamayan. Kaya po, ang siguradong pagbabago ay mga kandidato na gagawa ng batas na galing sana sa atin. Kayo ang pipili. Bahala na kayo kung gusto niyo sinong pili. Ngayon po, yan ay tinatawag na alyan ng bagong politika. Yan po ang bagong politika.
All right. Thank you. So that's just a clip from a documentary called The Rustling of Leaves. And the person you saw there is Ka Dante or Bernabe Boscaino, a well-known Filipino revolutionary who took up arms, as part of the New People's Army against the Marcos Dictatorship in the 60s and up to the 80s. And that is when, after the Marcoses were ousted, they ran under a progressive party called Partido ng Bayan or People's Party, to assert an agenda of reform, in the elections. Just a side note, he was actually later on ambushed, in one of his campaign sorties. Luckily, he survived. But many of those reform-minded people who are advocating for change would not be as lucky as Ka Dante, in which we continue to see now, right? Progressive candidates, activists, and human rights defenders are getting gunned down, really putting into question the democratic space we have in the Philippines. And yeah, so that's where our discussion, our presentation ends. We hope that this is a conversation starter to start and spark some conversations and discussions. And we think that this type of discussions should happen, in and engage as many of our kababayans as possible, right? And just to answer, I think, well, before I answer some questions, just I think some quick calls to action. Next slide. If this you think this education is helpful and thought-provoking and you want to get involved, we highly encourage you to join the Malaya Movement USA. The short link is there. This is one part of a series of discussion that the Malaya Movement is putting together. We hope we are planning on putting on a historical overview, a more full-on discussion on the Philippine elections from start to current next month, and then it will be followed by an educational discussion on political dynasties and its roots and its current implications. So please do sign up and join the Malaya Movement. Some of the questions that were raised, I think we have some time. I'm just looking for the questions. Are Filipino workers able to get off work? It is not declared as a non-working holiday. And on top of that, many are concerned with the current state of pandemic in the Philippines. I think there are discussions to extend the voting period, right? Just noting that overseas Filipinos are able to cast their vote for an entire month, which is something that we should really take advantage. In the Philippines, though, it's only on one day, May 9, the second Monday of May. In order for them to extend it, they have to pass a legislation, which there are no efforts still, and there are some rumors, right, that the administration is maneuvering to move the Philippine elections to 2025. Some people are questioning this as a maneuver to prolong the term of the current administration. And again, these are not off the table scenarios, right? With the knowing what is at stake, and the motives of the current regime. Another question: who are the groups considered party lists currently? There are many. I think there are links that were shared earlier, but as pointed out, this space that was crafted or carved for marginalized sectors of the Philippines are now flooded, by not fraudulent, but like really party lists that represents, not the marginalized sectors. Really, even political dynasties and powerful people are using the party list system as a loophole to continue on to their hold into power. The church, they are a very powerful sector in Philippine society, as evidence in Philippine history. But we have yet to see where they will position themselves in the upcoming elections. We know certain religious groups, such as the Iglesia ni Cristo, has been using their block voting policy to sway, and influence politicians. And then the elections being, being plurality, right? There was an effort to unite the opposition sometime last year. This did not work out so much. Hence, but under opposition groups that have united under Isang Bayan have attempted to unite the opposition to cast and to give their endorsement for a single candidate, and that turned out to be our current Vice President Leni Robredo and Senator Kiko Pangilinan. but noting that there are also so here in the U.S. And I think a united front of all the opposition movements is really key. I totally agree, to ensure that we defeat the current regime and prevent the return of the Marcoses in power. And on the case of a potential no election scenario, I think there are rumors out there, and there are some rumors circulating about a potential no election scenario. As I mentioned earlier, the possible moving of the Philippine elections in 2025. There are groups out there who are linked to the current regime that have filed a petition to move the Philippine elections. So these are developments that we have to keep our eyes on and be vigilant about. But at the end of the day, as in the experience of the 1986 people power, we believe that the biggest deterrent and the biggest weapon of the Filipino people to end the regime and to fight for change is an organized mass movement. So I think we can end it with that. Thank you so much for all those who joined us. And again, please join Malaya and support our work and all the other efforts of the various movements around here. Thank you so much.